Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. We're talking to another great writer today. Before I introduce you to our guest, I wanted to thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. The better our analytics are, the more likely others will find us. Also, we launched a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Screenwriter Bob DeRosa grew up in Florida and attended the University of Florida. After graduating, Bob returned to Orlando and became a leading figure in the city's theater and film community before moving to Los Angeles. Bob is best known for his work on Killers, The Air I Breathe, White Collar, and 20 Seconds to Live. Here's my conversation with Bob DeRosa. Thanks for spending some time with us today, Bob.
Absolutely.
So you're originally from Florida, right? Talk about growing up in Florida and I believe going to the University of Florida.
My family is originally from like St. Pete, Tampa area, which is where I was born. I was actually born in Dunedin, and then we moved around a lot as a kid, but I came back to Miami, I think at age 9. And then age 12, we ended up in Orlando. And Orlando, that was home in my mind. So like basically in time for 6th grade, started up at Rock Lake Middle School, actually, in Orlando. And then I grew up in Orlando in the 80s, which was like an amazing time to be there. So like, you know, Dungeons and Dragons was just coming out, so I could play that with my friends, and that incredible era of cinema. So like getting to see all the Star Wars movies in the theater and all the, you know, Indiana Jones movies in the theater, like just this incredible, all those 80s movies, and just being able to grow up with my friends and just be a part of that was awesome. And Orlando was just a really cool place to grow up. And most of my extended family, like aunts and uncles, I was really close to my cousins. They were still in the St. Pete, Tampa area, so we'd drive over there for holidays and summers to see everybody. And yeah, it was great. And then I made really good friends in middle school, then through high school in Lake Mary High School. And then a lot of us went to school together at University of Florida. And University of Florida was great. I majored in advertising because my mother really wanted me to have some sort of career to fall back on. And, because I was already kind of dipping my toe in filmmaking and wanting to write and figure out some way to make a living at it. And I felt that advertising was the only sort of businessy type degree that actually felt sort of creative. So I felt, okay, I'll major in that. And then instead of actually working on an advertising career, I would just spend all my off time making movies and writing scripts and just, doing the barest minimum I could do in advertising to get my degree. So even though it was supposed to be my fallback career, it never was that. It was just the thing to get my degree and be proud of that. And then, because I think in my heart, I'd already committed to the idea of like, in some way I was going to be a writer or a filmmaker. And that's how I wanted to try and, make a go of it.
You mentioned, being kind of a film buff at that age and then, spending a lot of time off to the side making films. What was it that drew you to the industry that kind of said to you that this was where you were going to be?
Actually, I was writing my whole life. Like I started writing when I was 6, and I wrote short stories forever, all the way through like middle school and into high school. And then one of my best friends, Ken Davis, and we started making films together, just little movies in high school. And I really enjoyed that. We actually would instead of writing a paper for our English class, we asked if we could make a little video instead. And all of a sudden, that form of storytelling just started kind of to make sense for us to do together. And I think I was also I remember because I was always in my head, I'm going to be an author someday. So I tried to write a novel in high school, and I realized I don't want to write all the descriptive stuff and what people are thinking. I just want to write the dialogue and the action. And I realized in that moment, I was like, oh, wait, maybe I want to write movies. And so when we went to college, Ken and I both went to University of Florida together, and they had the Crosscut Film and Video Society, which at the time would just allow us to check out super VHS cameras and these big clunky decks we'd have to, plug them into. But we would check those out, and we made like a almost feature-length vampire movie called Spectre. We spent 2 years on it, and we poured our hearts into these little college movies we made. And every time we made one, we'd get a group of people together and do a little premiere. And the first time we did that was a tiny little movie, and it was 30 people in the room, and they all laughed at the right spots. And that was the moment I was like, oh, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. This is it.
And then while you were in Central Florida, you still were involved with the Florida Film Festival, right?
Yeah, well, what happened is we graduated from, University of Florida, and like me and my friends, most of us moved back home to Orlando. Ken and I had partnered with another guy, Greg Pecora, who's still one of my closest friends, and we formed kind of a filmmaking production company called Triple N Productions, and we ended up making short films together, and we had aspirations to make a feature. And so we came back to Orlando. There was a moment, it was early 90s, and like Nickelodeon Studios, was hopping, and, a bunch of big movies that just shot in Orlando. And there was this feeling around that like Orlando's going to be Hollywood East. Like that's what everybody was saying. And so like we went there, and it's kind of a magical moment. And then it didn't happen exactly the way I think that people thought about it in their hearts. But the thing is, there's all these amazing resources and incredible professionals and all these really super talented people. So there's this incredible scene that was happening in Orlando, and it ended up being like a great place to kind of work on your chops and make cool stuff. And so one of the benefits of that scene was that we had, the Enzion, which is the theater in Orlando, which is, the home of the Florida Film Festival. So I would go see movies there all the time. Filmmakers would come through and do Q&As with their films. So we met Richard Linklater, who was doing, Q&As with Slacker, his first film. And so on the Florida Film Festival, they would always have special guests come in, and it was kind of like the first real moment when I could meet the filmmakers, and I could see the work, and I could be like, okay, this is something, that I want to be a part of. And so I was a jack of all trades basically in Orlando. Like I ended up doing improv at Sac Comedy Lab. I formed a improv and sketch troupe out of that called Them, which we had a really successful run for a lot of years. And so I was doing that stuff. I was writing and directing one-act plays. Me, Ken, and Greg were making short films. I was writing my own feature screenplays at that point. So I was doing a little bit of everything. I was an actor, and I was a casting assistant for like a really successful casting directors. And then kind of later on in my time in Orlando, a good friend of mine, Ben Rock, who we were aspiring filmmakers at the same time, recommended me for a job as a programming assistant at the Florida Film Festival. And Matthew Curtis was my boss. He's been programming director there for, I think, over 20 years now, and he's amazing. You should interview him. He's done so much for the Florida film community, because he's the guy that goes to Sundance and goes to all the festivals and meets filmmakers, and he has this incredible community that, and you see the Florida Film Festival reaps the rewards of that. It's amazing what he's built there. Anyway, so I ended up getting the job, and I worked for Matthew for 3 years, and working at the Florida Film Festival, I got to tour Sundance and meet a ton more filmmakers, and it just was a really important, it was very much an important stepping stone in my career of starting to, meet filmmakers who are actually doing it for a living. And that actually led to, and we'll get to it a little bit later, but the Florida Film Festival actually led to my first ever film getting made.
Well, and then eventually you make your way out to Los Angeles. So talk about how that came about.
Yeah, it was funny. The Orlando Weekly would always do their annual best of list, and there was a year where I was awarded, I guess, best Renaissance man by the Orlando Weekly, which is so cool. It's such a fun honor. And it was just basically, it was kind of mentioning how just I was involved with kind of everything I could be involved in with Orlando. And it got to that moment where I felt like, I think I've done everything I want to accomplish here, and what's next. And there was always that feeling about coming to Los Angeles and, making movies out here. And there was always this sort of energy around that idea where people were like, I'm not going to LA until they pay me to. And that was the energy around that. And I hit a moment. I wrote a couple of scripts that, one got optioned while I was in Orlando called Shooting Blanks, and local producer Todd Thompson, optioned it, and he attached amazing talent to it and a director, and we almost got it made. And that was kind of my first taste of like, okay, I think I can do this professionally. And then I wrote a script called Gifted that was a romantic dramedy, and a producer I'd worked with in Orlando had moved out to LA, Christopher Pratt, and he ended up kind of on a management track. And so I kept in touch with him, and he read Gifted, and he's like, yeah, you got to come out here. And so I went out to visit, and he showed me around LA, and I had a lot of friends that have already started to move there. There's so many talented people from Orlando that have made the move to Los Angeles, and that was the very beginning of those times. Enough people had already come out here where I was like, I could make the rounds and kind of feel like, okay, there's almost like a Orlando community already here, and having a couple of scripts that I was super proud of that I felt like would be a good sample. It just felt like the right time. And so, I at the Florida Film Festival, I think it was 2001. I did my kind of film festival duties. I introduced some films. I did a Q&A with Jason Lee and his movie Chasing Amy. That was my last time ever in an Orlando stage, was doing that Q&A. And then like 2 days after the festival, I packed up my bags and shipped a bunch of boxes and hopped in a plane and came out to LA.
And so I mentioned in our open some of your credits. So let's talk about a few of them once you're out in LA. So The Air I Breathe, starring Brendan Fraser, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Andy Garcia, Kevin Bacon, and a number of other well-known actors. 2 people received writing credits for that film, and you were one of them. So was that kind of your big break? Talk about that film.
Yeah, I would say so. When I first moved to actually back in the Florida Film Festival, one of my jobs was to communicate with visiting filmmakers, and so there was a writer director named Jiho Lee that had done an award-winning Sundance film, and he won an award at our festival, at the Florida Film Festival, and it was my job to call him and bug him until he came to the festival to accept his award. And he showed up, and it was kind of my job to show him around and show him a good time. And we just saw a bunch of movies and ran around downtown Orlando and had a blast. And we just hit it off, and we kept in touch. And he was living in Los Angeles when I moved out here, and he's American-born Korean, so he's flying back and forth to Seoul, shooting music videos over there. And I was just like, hey, there's when I first moved out to LA, it was weird timing. A good friend of mine, Lena Bhutan, was producing an evening of my one-act plays, and they were plays that I had written in Orlando, and then she wanted to mount them in Los Angeles, so she put together a team of directors and a cast and everything. I invited Jiho to come see the show, and nobody comes to see your plays in LA, so the fact that he actually showed up and enjoyed them was awesome. And then he was like, hey, I've been thinking about making my first feature, and I'd love some help. I loved your dialogue. Do you want to come on board and help me out with this? And so I did. And that was The Air I Breathe. And it was his dream project. At first, it was going to be shot in Korean language, based on a Chinese proverb, 4 different emotions, each character representing a different emotion, and kind of how their lives intertwine. And he originally just brought me on to write one of those emotions, pleasure, which was the character that Brendan Fraser ended up playing. And so I wrote that vignette, and then he wrote the other 3 vignettes. We put them all together, and he had a really strong ambition, what he wanted the story to be. And so we had a first draft, and he knew it wasn't there yet, but we'd been friends because this process took a while. It probably took us a year just to get that first draft. And so at that point, I had a feeling of what he wanted, and it just wasn't on the page yet. So I read it, and I was like, okay, Jiho, give me a couple of weeks. Let me just do a pass. And so he said, fine. And so it was like 2 of the most intense writing weeks of my life. And I rewrote the script, and, I polished a lot of the dialogue. I added some characters. I moved some things around, and I brought it back, and I was like, is this it? And I gave it to him, and he read it and said, this is my movie. This is it. And that took it off to the races at that point. So with a script that we co-wrote together, Christopher, who'd become my manager, read it, signed Jiho as a client, and then he started sending the script out. And producer Paul Schiff and his partner Ty Duncan came on board to produce. And it was about another 2-year journey to get the movie cast and financed. And then we ended up shooting in Mexico City with like a $10 million budget. And it's his debut feature, and he's directing Oscar-winning actors. And it was an amazing experience. And I had the writer's dream. I was like on set every day watching this film coming together. So it's definitely my, I'd done a little bit of writing for the studios at that point. I'd actually sold a pitch and written a script for the studios, but Air I Breathe was my first movie made. It was my first labor of love, and it really was, in my mind, the beginning of my career.
Then your next big project was Killers with Ashton Kutcher and Katherine Heigl. You're credited with the story and the screenplay on that one. Talk a little bit about that writing process.
Yeah, the writing of Killers. Basically, we'd come back from shooting Air I Breathe, and Jiho went into the editing room, and I would help with that. I'd come in and watch cuts and rewrite voiceover and stuff like that. But basically, he was super busy, and I had to get started on my next project, and I couldn't use the Air I Breathe as a sample for me as a writer by myself. It's one of those weird things about the way Hollywood works. It's like if there's two names on the cover, then you can't use that as a sample for one of the writers. And all my personal samples were a few years old, so I needed something fresh, and I was kind of mad that I had this script that was beloved around town and I couldn't use it to get work. And so I kind of did some soul searching, and I'd written in a lot of different genres. I'd written like that romantic dramedy Gifted I mentioned. I wrote a time-hopping mutant-killing movie called Hatchet Club that got me my first agent and got me a lot of work. So, but people kind of didn't know what to do with me. So I'm like, I'm going to write a script that's going to take everything I love and put it into one thing. So I wrote a script called Five Killers, which was a high concept but low budget action movie with heart. It was romantic but not a big love story. It was funny but not an outright comedy. It was poignant, and it was just cool, like violent and fun. And so everything that I loved, I kind of jammed into one script. I wrote it in my little apartment in Burbank, and I wrote a first draft. I turned it into Christopher, and it's funny, at that point he gave me the script back with some notes, but he also gave me a copy of Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, which has become a really popular screenwriting book, and I read it at exactly the right moment. And so I kind of took my script, I restructured it, and then wrote a second draft and turned that back in to my manager, and he read it. It's like, okay, this is it. And so we went out with that script, and Lionsgate had actually just hired Jiho and I based on Air I Breathe, because the movie had gotten finished at that point. They saw the movie, and they hired Jiho and I to adapt a property for them. And they knew Air I Breathe, but they were like, oh, well, Bob's on this. Can we see his new sample? And my manager said no, because he didn't want to just sell it to somebody. He wanted to make the movie. And so Lionsgate's like, what if we've sort of read it, even though we're not supposed to have, and we would like to buy it? My manager said no. And then Lionsgate said, what if we offered you this much money? And my manager said yes. And so we sold a script to Lionsgate, and then the reason it's a shared credit is I went through, with Air I Breathe, I had the dream job of like co-writing with the director, which kind of protected me. And so I was on set every day, and he had my back, I had his. Killers was a different situation where they bought the script, and I did revisions. I wrote for two different directors that they had attached, but eventually the feeling at the studio was like, we want this to be less of an action movie with a rom-com subplot and more of a rom-com with a little bit of an action movie subplot. And so at that point, eventually they brought in Ted Griffin, who's a super successful screenwriter, to rewrite me. And it's super common that happens in Hollywood, but it's also tough when it's your first time. And so Ted Griffin rewrote my script, and then a lot of writers came after him and rewrote. So when it finally went into production, they had what they call arbitration, which is like how the Writers Guild figures out how to give credit. And so I kind of argued my case as to why, I still deserve, a great deal of credit, and they agreed with me. And so I got sole story credit, and then I shared the writing of the screenplay. I shared that credit with Ted Griffin. And so it's one of those, and yeah, it's kind of an old Hollywood story of just, who gets credit and what kind of work's done. But I'm super proud of the film. It got made. It's in thousands of theaters, and it's not exactly the movie I originally envisioned, but it's still, I think, really entertaining, and I'm really proud of it.
And then shortly after Killers is actually one of my personal favorite shows of the last decade, White Collar. So you have credits for story editing and writing. What do you remember about that process?
Yeah, White Collar was also one of my favorite shows. So like my wife and I were just fans of that show. And then after Killers, kind of a tough time in Hollywood, because the writer's strike had happened and the financial crash had happened, so they just weren't buying a lot of scripts. It was kind of the beginning of the move to television for a lot of writers, and so I wrote a pilot for a show that I never sold the pilot, but people really liked it, and I got a lot of meetings out of it. And one of those was at Fox Television Studios, which made White Collar. And so I met an executive there who put the script in front of the showrunner, Jeff Easton, because I just mentioned I really liked White Collar. And I'm like, oh, if I ever get a chance, if there's ever an opening on that show. And they had pretty much the same writing staff for the first 2 seasons of that show. There weren't really any openings. And then, I'm sorry, for the first really 3 seasons. And then in the 4th season, Jeff had sold another show, and so all of a sudden he was split between these 2 shows. And so I got the call that they needed one extra writer in that room, and they interviewed a bunch of people, and they interviewed me, and I got the job. And it was a dream because I was already a fan of the show. They'd already started working on the 4th season, so I came in like a month into the process. So they'd already broken kind of the mythology of what was going to happen that season. They'd already written a couple of scripts, and the way television works is you're breaking episodes, there's so many moving parts at the same time, and you kind of have to get with the rhythm pretty quickly. So like, even though they were only written 2 scripts, they were breaking episode 8 when I walked in that day. So I sat on the couch and they're like, here's what episode 8 is. And I'm looking at a giant whiteboard covered with all the beats of the show. And I just had to jump in, and luckily everybody was so cool. It was the nicest group of writers, super supportive. They were all really curious about features, so they would ask me about features. But also I was curious about how to break television and how that process goes. And so I was really just attentive and pitched in what I could. Everybody's pitching ideas, trying to make the best stories. And then we're always, bringing those ideas to our showrunner, because ultimately it's up to him because it's his vision. So it was an amazing process. And it's funny. It's like you kind of have to figure out where your strengths are when you work in television and like how you can help best. So when I started, they were doing these 2-page outlines, and that kind of was creating some troubles because basically they weren't detailed enough. And so there was a shift right in the middle of that season where they're like, okay, we're going to go to like 12-page outlines. And everybody was like, oh gosh, this is completely different. We don't know, But for me as a feature writer, all I'm doing is writing 20-page treatments. So it's very common for me. So I jumped in and just volunteered. I ended up writing more than a handful of outlines that season, just because I felt it was something I was quick at and could help with. So it was one of those things where, I just learned how to jump in. And my story editor credit is it's a credit for kind of my level of writer producer. I lucked out. I jumped ahead of staff writer and went straight to story editor. And it just means that I'm a writer, but also with some producing abilities on the show. And then I was lucky. I wasn't even guaranteed an episode, but they ended up giving me an episode that I co-wrote with Matt Negretti, who's now the showrunner of the brand new Walking Dead show. And Matt's incredibly talented and was a wonderful writer to collaborate with. And we co-wrote, I think, I'm going to say it's a fan favorite of that season. It was the episode where Peter and Elle got kidnapped by kind of the young Bonnie and Clyde couple. And I got to go to New York. I got to cover my episode, which means I got to be on set and, just be there as a resource in case they needed me. And it was a great experience, and I loved it. I learned so much from that experience, so I'm grateful for it.
And it sounds like prior to that, while you may have had writing partner or a couple of people, was that the first time it was really a big collaborative group that you were part of?
Yes. Like I would write stuff with Jiho, but so much of my career has been me by myself in my office writing screenplays. And when you're writing by yourself and you run into a wall and you're like, I don't know how to get through this story problem, you're kind of stuck. You're by yourself. So you just pace a lot and drink coffee and try to figure your situation out. When you're in a writer's room with a bunch of writers, all the time you're running into these walls. You're running into story hiccups, and you got to figure out your ways around it. And there's a great deal of comfort that comes when you look around and you're like, I don't know what to do. And you look around and like, oh, there's 8 other people here and they don't know what to do either. We're in this together. And then as a group, you just start throwing out the worst possible ideas, because eventually you're going to get to the good idea that gets you past your problem. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. And it's different because, like I said, like when you work in television, you're serving the vision of the showrunner. So it's not about what I think is the funniest idea or the coolest story beat. It's about what's going to serve the showrunner's vision and kind of serve the show. So like you're really, the show is your master, and you just need to, do everything you can to make the show as good as possible. So it takes kind of leaving ego at the door, but I think that's a great creative exercise. Just, it's not about me, it's about us. It's about making a great show. And so I learned a lot from that, but I also understand like that's how great television gets made, is it's always a group of people that figure out how to work together and make something cool.
And I've actually seen online that there's some petitions and some push to bring back white collar. You don't have any inside information on that, do you?
No, not really. I mean, I see it too, because a bunch of white collar fans follow me on Twitter, and some of us are friends on Facebook, and it's such a nice gang, and they're so passionate, and they absolutely want their show to come back. But I have not heard any rumors about whether that ever might happen. Who knows? A lot of shows are getting rebooted now, so who knows what will happen.
Right. And now, more recently, you were the writer and co-creator for 20 Seconds to Live, which is dubbed a horror comedy anthology for people who hate happy endings, which is hilarious. So if my research is correct, you're the only creator credit. So talk about that project.
Sure. I mentioned Ben Rock, who's also a Floridian, and we were friends back in the day. Got my job at the Florida Film Festival. He ended up being production designer and working on helping to make the original Blair Witch Project. And so Ben moved out to LA just before I did, and we've been friends forever. And he ended up directing a lot and writing as well. And he directed a feature for Warner Brothers called Alien Raiders, which is a terrible title but wonderful film. And Ben and I would have kind of had these parallel careers, and we would often do theater together. And so we were both members for a while at Sacred Fools Theater Company in Hollywood. And so we would, they had a late night show called Serial Killers, which is just a really fun show. And I would write stuff and Ben would direct it. And we pretty much would just do that to always have something creative happening, because so much of Hollywood is pitching and chasing jobs and trying to get financing, and just you get told no a lot. So it was really empowering to just say, yes, we're going to make some cool, ridiculous theater that's, bloody and funny and fun. And so Ben and I did a lot of that stuff together. And eventually Ben was like, you know what? I own a bunch of gear. We could just shoot something, take the energy we put towards theater and put it towards actually shooting something, and make something that we can actually put out there. And so he pitched me the idea for 20 Seconds to Live, which is they're super short episodes. They're anthologies, so every episode's a new group of characters. At some point, a 20-second counter comes up on screen. When it counts down to 0, somebody dies. And figuring out who's going to get it and how is a lot of the fun. And so he pitched me the idea. I loved it. We kind of banded it back and forth a bit until we figured out kind of what the show would be, and we experimented with some things. I wrote a couple episodes, which we sort of shot as pilots just to see if the idea would work, and we showed it to a bunch of our friends who really enjoyed the episodes. We did this actually with our producer, Kat Pacey. Actually, she really helped us out as far as making the show a reality. But then I showed it to another producer friend who's very successful in the web series world. She saw it. She's like, oh, I love the game of this. And we're like, what game? We don't understand. But we realized, oh, once you know the show, then it's like, then you're watching going, who's going to die? How's it going to happen? And then it became a matter of, oh, we got to figure out creative and interesting ways to keep our audience guessing and for it to not be predictable. So Ben and I co-created this show together, and Ben directs every episode. I wrote every episode except a couple that Ben and I co-wrote. But we took the created by credit, because as far as show running a TV show, it's what Ben and I did, is we created the template and figured out, the best way to keep telling these stories. And, Kat was our producer for both seasons. We did an 8-episode first season, and then we have another 5-episode second season. We've played 20 web and film festivals. We've won a bunch of awards, kind of traveled the world. I got, a special festival award at Rain Dance in London. And we've traveled with it and met a ton of other filmmakers, and it's been an awesome experience. I mean, we've made $0. The first season we paid for out of our pockets, and, we spent almost no money on it. So it was a lot of favors from friends. The second season we did an Indiegogo campaign and raised $10,000, which enabled us to do 4 more episodes, which those episodes just, released recently, and we're super excited because we had a little bit of money and we could have more ambitious special effects, and, just we were able to kind of, up the ante a bit with what we did in the show. But it's almost been like a little boot camp for how to make television, which, I've made television, but this is the first time Ben and I have gotten to create something together. I still write stuff on my own, but I actually have a really great creative partnership with Ben, and so getting to make this has actually led to other work for us, and hopefully more work in the future. We'll see.
And where do people find that?
Oh, that's at 20secondstolive.com is the easiest way to find it. You can also find it on Facebook. I think we get most of our views on Facebook. So yeah, if you just search 20 Seconds to Live, you'll find us. And they're not safe for work. Some of them are a little bloody. If you don't mind the bloody stuff, Anniversary is the first episode we ever released, and that's a great place to start. If you don't like bloody stuff, watch Evil Doll, which tiny bit of blood, but it's not. It's a very funny episode, and it's about an evil doll, and the guy. There's a cameo from Tom Holland, who directed the first Chucky movie, Child's Play.
Oh, fun.
So that's a little fun meta inside joke that we were very, very proud of.
Now, on your website, you have a tab that actually says my feature writing process. And I found that a little unusual that you just lay it out there. What's your thinking behind putting that on your website?
Well, that came about because I'm in a writer's group, and we've been a group of mostly Orlando transplants, some other friends that we've made out here. And the membership has kind of shifted over the years, but it's always about 10 or 11 of us. And we've been together on and off for 10 years. Like, I actually workshopped 5 Killers through them years ago. And it used to be everybody would bring in scripts and we'd take turns and give each other feedback. And now, as the industry gets tougher and tougher, it's really just become a place to kind of commiserate and give support to each other as we just try to work our way through this incredibly difficult career. And one of the guys in the group was just at some point was like, you know what, we've all got such different processes for how we write. We should all like write posts and share them so we can just read how each of us does it, how we all do it differently. And so that was kind of the inspiration for it. And so I wrote an essay about my feature writing process. And I've blogged, not a ton. I'm not like a super successful blogger, but like when Air I Breathe was in production, I had a really popular blog on MySpace because Sarah Michelle Gellar was in it and everybody wanted to read about her. So like I've always written about my work in this industry and sort of my process. And I'm just a big believer in like, there's no reason to keep that stuff secret. It's like, we're all in this together. We're all trying to make stuff. So anything that I write that helps somebody else with their stuff, that's, karmic payback for the fact that I read, John August's website and listen to his podcast with Craig Mazin and get all kinds of amazing insights from them. So it's like, I feel like I think the industry is better when we're all kind of giving to each other and helping each other. And so the essay that I wrote about my feature process, my group really appreciated it. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to put this on my blog. Especially like sometimes people will reach out to me and they want to write movies, but they have no idea how to start. And I'm just like, well, here it is. Here's what I do. And I think the important thing is like, that's what works for me. Everybody's going to have a different process, but I found it very helpful in my early days to read people's processes or to hear how people make stuff and realize, oh, there's not one way to do it. It's lots of different ways. So the more of that you can avail yourself of, I think the more you can figure out how to make, how you can make your thing.
I think that's great. And it actually makes a ton of sense. So Bob, your writing is really diverse. You have some horror, some drama, some action comedy. Do you have a preference, or is one genre easier or harder for you?
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's always fun genre stuff with some sort of heart in it. Like that's what I feel like I always bring is like whether I'm writing straight up, something scary or something action packed, there's got to be some sort of heart in it, or I can't kind of hook into how to write it. As far as the genre, it kind of depends on the medium and who I'm working with. So when it comes to horror, that's the stuff I do with Ben because Ben loves horror. And so all of our stuff has been some form of either horror or really dark comedy. And, I know I've come up with a good idea if it makes Ben laugh. So like that's 20 Seconds to Live has been this awesome exercise of me going, what about this? What about this? And then saying the thing that makes him crack up. I'm like, that's going to work. And those are always our best episodes. And so then, I still write a lot of theater, and my theater sometimes is just really broad, ridiculous comedy, but still with a punch of heart at the end. And then my feature stuff has been very character-driven, genre, action-oriented, but hopefully with a little bit of humor and a little bit of heart. I tried writing like very broad action comedies, and that kind of wasn't my world. So I feel like everything I write has sort of a through line, but I feel like it's always good to kind of have different, variations on that, and to kind of keep yourself fresh and interested and challenged, really. And so, yeah, it's interesting when you say that, to kind of step back from my career and go, oh, I guess it does look really diverse, sort of weird, but I don't know, it all makes sense to me, because also there's the 20 other scripts that haven't been made, and multiple action comedies, a couple of horror movies, a little bit. I've kind of dipped my toe into some near future sci-fi, which none of that's been produced, but a lot of that work has been successful for me and got me other jobs. So I think that's maybe my next goal. I think is moving to some near future stuff, because that's a genre I really enjoy as well. So as long as there's character and there's heart, I can hopefully play in any genre.
When you're approached by people wanting to get in the industry, what do you tell them? What advice do you give them?
Let's see. When people approach and ask advice, I mean, I'm always about, you have to work on your craft. I think a lot of times people will reach out to me on Twitter and say, hey, I wrote my first screenplay. How do I sell it? And my answer is usually write 5 more, and then ask me that question, because it's a matter of time and perseverance. And it's just super important to work on your craft and get really good at what you do. And so that can take a while. So, I tell them to be in it for the long haul, and work a lot, practice a lot. And then, because eventually when you start moving into becoming, quote, a professional, there's a lot of luck and timing that comes with that. And so you want to make sure that when luck and timing comes your way, you're ready for it. If you've only written one script and you kind of don't have a process yet, and that luck drops in your lap, you may not be able to do something with it. But if you've written 5 or 10 screenplays and you've really figured things out, when it becomes your moment, you'll be ready for it. So there's that. And I'm a big believer in, you have to get your work in front of people. And the thing about writing especially is that you can kind of do it in a vacuum, because if you're writing feature scripts and trying to sell them, that can just take a long time. So what are the ways that you can get your work in front of an audience that doesn't cost you either very much money or any money at all? So that's why I write theater. It doesn't cost anything to put up a play, basically. I've written, short films. I've done a web series, and like anything that you can do to put your work in front of people, just see if it's working. I think so many people they think they're great and they love what they do. And I'm like, there's that moment when you put it in front of an audience. Is an audience laughing at your jokes? Is an audience reacting emotionally when you want them to? If not, great. That's how you learn and get better. And I think some people skip that step, and I think it's a vital one. So I always recommend to people, basically work on your craft and, get some sort of like real-time audience feedback to know if you're improving, because that's an important part of the process.
And I've interviewed a handful of writers, and their advice for getting good at writing is to write more. And I get that, but what's the next level to that? I mean, writing just to write is one thing, but how do you make sure that there's a purpose behind your writing?
First of all, I think you have to have something to say, and that's just about living and having a life and having experience and having values and having themes that kind of emerge for you. And so that makes your writing special and different. But I think it's also, yes, you have to keep writing to get better. I think having a goal, like knowing where you want to go, like so many people just like, I want to write screenplays. I'm like, great, that's a huge wide chasm of writing. It's like you can write giant studio movies, you can write, little independent movies, you can write horror movies. There's multiple genres, multiple budget levels. You move into TV now, there's like so many different ways and so many different corners of the industry. So I think the thing that people always resist is putting themselves in a box and going, I write Blumhouse style horror movies. People don't want to do that. They want to say, I can write anything. It actually helps to go, no, I want to write, Simon Kinberg giant science fiction movies. That's what I want to do. Or I want to write, Spielberg movies, because then you're working towards a goal, and then you can become an expert in those movies. If you're like, I want to write big Amblin style movies, you watch all the Amblin movies, you watch all the Spielberg movies, you read the scripts, you compare them, you become an expert in that particular zone, and then you write towards it. And then the thing is like, even as you're doing that, once you get there, that doesn't mean you can't split off and go, well, great, I've written my giant Amblin movie, now I'm going to write a little independent movie. And if you've been becoming an expert at a certain type of writing, when you try to then peel off and do a different type of writing, it'll be a little bit easier because you've already kind of done a lot of the heavy lifting as far as your craft. And then on top of that, the other super important thing is, like I said, you don't want to write in a vacuum. So in addition to having, like, doing short films and things like that you can put up on an audience, you have to be a person that's willing to put your scripts in front of peers that you trust and get really quality feedback from them, because learning how to rewrite your scripts and get your scripts better is a huge part of the job. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people kind of fall in love with their own words and, like, here it is, it's done. And I'm like, if that's the way you feel, then, become a novelist. But novelists know that that's not even the way it is. You always have an editor. You always have somebody that's helping you get from point A to point Z, like wherever the end of your project is. So, like I said, I've got this great community of writer friends that love me, but they're really tough. Like, they're hard to please. So, like, they're going to give me feedback that really, that counts. That's good stuff. And, like, being able to be open to that, that's a hard thing to learn. I think especially a lot of young writers, when they start out, they have a hard time being open to good constructive feedback, and learning how to take that and improve your script is a huge part of the job. And so I think that's the next step. It's not just writing. It's like learning how to rewrite, learning how to take in feedback, learning how to, evolve your writing in the direction that you want to go for a career. It's a lot, but that's also part of it. I've written over 30 scripts. I think my 16th script got made. It's like, it's a long journey. So people that think they're going to write a script and sell it and become, Quentin Tarantino, I'm like, good luck. For the rest of us, right. There's a lot of hard work.
So I don't want you to name names unless you want to, but what's next for you?
Geez, I'm looking at I have a board in my office with all my projects and all my irons in the fire. So, I mean, I'm still really focused in the feature world. Feature business has changed a lot. So I've kind of had to evolve. I'm writing, I think, in smaller budgets now, but I've got an action thriller with producers attached, and they just brought on a director, and she's wonderful. And so I'm really excited about that script. So I'm hoping that'll move towards production. I have another brand new script on top of that I'm a couple drafts into that I'm excited about. And then I had this fun detour with Ben Rock, who after we did 20 Seconds to Live, we were hired to co-write an original with the first original podcast for Shudder, which is a horror streaming network, and that's called Video Palace, which you can find out on iTunes, and it's a 10-episode sort of Serial meets Blair Witch Project. So it's kind of an investigative podcast that sounds like it's real, but then it veers into horror, and it's really cool, and we're really proud of it. And so Ben and I kind of fell in love with doing audio projects, and so we've actually we're in negotiations to write a horror audio drama for a very big player. So I'm not going to name names because we're still in negotiations, but So having fun in the audio world, it's kind of a new playground that a lot of film and TV writers are moving into, and it's fun, and so that's really cool. I'm excited about that. And then coming full circle, that the screenplay that kind of got me my start in the industry, Gifted, that romantic dramedy I told you about 20 years ago, I adapted it as a play, and it's going to have a world premiere January 2020 at Sacred Fools Theater in Hollywood. That story that's been a part of my life for 20 years is finally going to have its due and be out there for the world to see. So I'm very excited about that.
Nice. Thanks for taking time to be on the podcast with us today, Bob. I really appreciate you sharing the insights. And if people want to read more about you, where can they go?
Thank you, John. This is super fun. People can find me on Twitter is actually the easiest way, at ThemBob, THEM as in Mary, BOB. That's my improv troupe, Them, Bob. At ThemBob at Twitter is, I'm always on there, and I'm happy to talk shop with anybody who has questions. I also do have a website, bobderosawriter.com, that I have not updated in many years. So hopefully I'll get back to that. And then, of course, they can check out 20 Seconds to Live at 20secondstolive.com. So go check out an episode.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.